wonders about how things are brought to a particular light at a particular time.
Paul?
Well, there are several points to make here, I think. First of all, is the Resolution 674 does remind Iraq that under international law it is liable for any loss, damage or injury as a result of the invasion and illegal occupation of Kuwait. It then says it invites states to collect relevant information with a view to such arrangements as may be established in accordance with international law. Now, what Lieutenant General Khalid bin Sultan was saying is that people will be held responsible for war crimes, but there is in fact no mechanism established yet by the Allied powers, let alone by the Security Council, to put that into effect. So if he was signalling that this is going to happen, that is one thing. But if he was just simply saying people who we believe are causing these atrocities in Kuwait will be held accountable, that may be more of a short-term sort of political restraint on those people. To pick up Chris's and your point about these atrocities in Kuwait, I would certainly agree that much more work needs to be done on this, because it was being said in Downing Street this morning that Mr. Major and Chancellor Cole talked about this in their telephone conversation this morning, and they agreed that these reports needed further checking, because otherwise we're going to be in a situation, like the Belgium atrocities by the Germans in the First World War, the breasts cut off and everything, and we're getting very similar kind of stories here. What are the sources for these? Was this whipped up by the Allied powers to justify an immediate move and a refusal to wait until the Soviet initiative had come to greater fruition? We'll have to find out more about that. But there is no mechanism at the moment to deal with war crimes, and this is one of the decisions that actually we await.
Presumably, it is just the point of view, though, if you... because remember, we were taking lots and lots of prisoners of the Allied forces. I asked him about his impressions of Allied progress in the land war to date.
The speed of movement does appear to be considerable and well in advance of schedule, and I think that everybody will be pleased with that, especially if it were to mean that the duration of the ground conflict will be very short. But, of course, nobody can absolutely count upon that. And I think we'll be in a better position to make judgments after the first major encounters with the Republican Guard have taken place. One thing I am delighted to see, and that is the massive number of Iraqi troops that are surrendering. It's much the best for our forces, obviously, and it's the best for them too.
What do you think that tells you about the morale of the Iraqi forces and their willingness to fight?
The Iraqi forces have to be divided broadly, I think, into two, and I think everybody knows this, between the conscripts, who are there under duress, and the Republican Guard, who are a kind of Saddam Waffen-SS and are ideologically committed, or at least so far as we know. And consequently, therefore, the morale amongst both must be pretty low. They've been without a square meal for some weeks. Their water supplies are down. They've got no guarantees of medical support or of reinforcement. So that's bound to have an effect on any soldier's attitude, whatever part of an army they come from. So far as the conscripts are concerned, they must be, in their present state of health and isolation, ready to give in to our people. And I just hope that all of them do. That's almost an impossible hope, but the more that do it, the better that campaign is going to go.
Do you welcome a clash with the Republican Guard to the extent that it might enable the Allies to tackle Iraq's military machine?
No, I would welcome a mass surrender by the Republican Guard for a variety of reasons, not least, of course, the reduction of casualties, but also because there could be no clearer way of communicating the message to the people of Iraq that we are not after the humiliation of Iraq or its people, and that the victory in the ground conflict has been secured by means of the acknowledgement of realities, even by the Republican Guard. I think that would be a very good avenue to post-war stability and peace. It can't be guaranteed, but it certainly would be the best course.
Does that mean that, on the assumption that the Allied forces reach the southern border of Iraq, that they should stop there, that they shouldn't seek out and destroy the retreating Iraqis?
I think the definition of war aims, repeated again this morning, for instance, by Lawrence Eagleburger, the Deputy Secretary of State, was very clear and very specific, and it does say that the ambition of the coalition is not to secure the toppling of the Iraqi government or indeed the removal of Saddam Hussein. There wouldn't be a heavy heart in the world if he, by some means, didn't see this crisis out, but that cannot be an aim, any more than some kind of charge on Baghdad can be an aim. It wouldn't be politically tenable, so far as the coalition is concerned. It couldn't be sustained in terms of any prolonged stay in Iraq is concerned, and of course it would invite additional possibilities of casualties and preoccupy forces that want to be out of that theatre of operations as quickly as possible. So I think that the definition that we had again this morning is the definition as it has existed throughout. Get Iraq out of Kuwait, restore peace and stability in the area, and then move to the political process, which is essential to gain enduring peace and stability and indeed justice for all the peoples of the region.
So do you draw a clear line at Kuwait's northern border, thus far and no further?
It's very difficult to draw an absolute line, a map line as it were, because it'll depend on the circumstances in which that border is reached. If the Iraqi forces are conducting a fighting retreat, for instance, it wouldn't be possible to say, whoops, we've come to the line, this is the batting crease and we don't go any further. But of course it'll depend on the circumstances, and nobody, even at this stage in the second day of the ground conflict, can really forecast precisely how that will work out.
That was the Leader of the Opposition, Neil Kinnock, talking a little earlier today. The time is just after 2:30. You're listening to Radio 4 News FM. Let's have a summary of the news now from Peter Donaldson.
The Saudis have given their first military briefing since the start of the land war. Their commander, Lieutenant General Khalid bin Sultan, said 20,000 Iraqis had been captured so far. He put the number of casualties in the Arab forces as 5 dead and 20 wounded. He also said that atrocities against the civilian population were still being committed by Iraqi troops in Kuwait. Reports from Western military sources in Saudi Arabia say Allied planes are attacking a convoy of 80 Republican Guard tanks heading south to confront advancing coalition forces. One source said the tanks were within hours of making contact with Allied troops unless they were destroyed. The reports suggest that Allied forces are about 50 miles from the center of Kuwait City and could be there by nightfall. Iraqi land forces have launched a missile attack on Allied ships in the Gulf. The British destroyer HMS Gloucester detected the incoming Silkworm on its radar and intercepted it with its own Sea Dart missiles. There were no casualties and no damage. The latest military communique from Iraq claims that soldiers from its Third Army have inflicted a heavy defeat on Allied forces in Kuwait and have launched a counter-offensive. It said that American, Egyptian and Saudi troops were involved in fierce battles around Iraqi positions. The Director of Public Prosecutions has said he can no longer rely on police evidence to uphold the convictions of the 6 men jailed for the Birmingham pub bombings of 1974.
American media's coverage of the war overnight.
The start of the ground war has also marked the beginning of a new battle between the networks to provide the best coverage. And the early verdict from the critics is that the big three, that is CBS, NBC and ABC, have been able to even the score with CNN, which was considered to have led the field in the early stages of the war. In particular, CBS had been getting a lot of flack recently for being too slow off the mark, and there was much speculation in the press that the main anchorman, Dan Rather, could be on the way out. But in the flighty way of television, all that's been changed by a couple of days of broadcasting. Dan Rather is still being criticised for being both too straight-laced and over-dramatic. But when one television critic wrote this morning that Rather had become rather teary-eyed when he spoke of young men who would hear the call to battle and might not return, he said, too, that Rather was the only anchor who took care to point out that war is more than arrows on a map and nifty aerial footage. But the network's secret weapon is reporter Bob McEwen, who provided the first on-the-scene dispatch from the front lines on Saturday night, having gone there independently without a U.S. military escort. This morning he sent this dispatch.
We are approximately a third of the way from the border into Kuwait City with Allied troops. It's a convoy, mostly Saudis, some Kuwaitis, and some U.S. Marines. A mile ahead of me, there's a line of tanks, and there's another line of rocket launchers firing in on Kuwaiti positions. Now, tanks have a maximum range of 8 miles, so that means the Kuwaitis are no more than 9 miles from where I am right now. There also has been some small arms fire and machine gun fire off to the side, and I take it to mean that there are a few pockets of Iraqi presence closer than that. The trip itself was fascinating. We crossed the border in the early morning hours when it was dark, and we could only really see what was on the road ahead of us. There are no lights there, of course. At the customs shed, everything was chaos. There were burned out hulks of cars. As you went further along the highway almost all the way up here is in complete disarray, great gouges of asphalt and earth out of the center of it. There are mines everywhere and unexploded cluster bombs. You can see the cluster bombs. The mines are on the desert floor. Back south of where we are, there are Saudi troops combing the desert, looking for them. Just up ahead of us, there have been helicopters hovering over the desert, and I understand what they're doing is clearing the mines too. And what happens is the downward air pressure from the rotor blade exposes the mine, creates the pressure that is needed to set it off, but by the time it does go off, which is a couple of seconds later, the helicopter has got off again. So it's been quite interesting watching that all the way up here. Hulks of cars, power lines down, the road in complete disarray. One side of this is a 4-lane highway. One side of the highway is completely dug up. The other side is like a slalom course. And there are paths on either side of it created by engineers, by Saudi engineers, I guess, and the vehicles heading up here are keeping very, very close to that beaten path.
For some days now, the CBS Breakfast Show has been co-anchored live from Saudi Arabia by Harry Smith. Today, he reported that Allied forces were getting ready for an attack on the Republican Guard.
Lead elements of the U.S. 2nd Marine Division made their way past the burning oil wells of Kuwait to the outskirts of Kuwait City itself and prepared to link up with paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne already on the ground. While commanders warned that street fighting in the city could be heavy and prolonged, resistance met in the drive up was reported generally light.
I think that perhaps we expected a little bit more resistance than what we've encountered so far, but it's far from over. The fight is far from over yet.
On the Western Front, pilots this morning report that 80 Iraqi tanks have emerged from the bunkers of the Republican Guard. Headed directly at them across the Iraqi desert to the south is an Allied army, hundreds of artillery pieces, rocket launchers, and tanks preparing to confront the best troops that Saddam Hussein has to offer.
I said it's either them or me, and well, I love my family and I'm going home to them. So I'm going to get those guys.
The biggest factor slowing the march of advance on all fronts is the flood of enemy prisoners, flushed from their tanks and bunkers, impromptu white banners marking surrender. Long columns of POWs now march toward the rear. While they refuse to release exact figures, commanders say Allied casualties have been very light. Marine Lance Corporal Martin Wilcox was hit, moving into position to cross an Iraqi minefield.
I knew I was going to put it on, for the most part, versus just rock and roll, and that's what wound up happening because they tried to put down a high degree of fire on us, and we returned that high degree of fire and overwhelmed them.
From Baghdad this morning, the war seems very different. Betsy Aaron, under the watchful eyes of Iraqi censors, is in Baghdad this morning.
Iraqis get news of the war from Baghdad radio, and this morning the news was good. According to military communique number 62, the Iraqi 3rd Corps launched a counteroffensive last night against Allied forces. The Allies were driven back on all fronts. The Iraqis have retaken all positions. What's more, when the Allies withdrew, according to the communique, they left their tanks behind, burning in the desert. The defeated divisions were the U.S. 2nd Armored and the Egyptian 4th, with some unidentified Saudi forces thrown in for good measure. The news of the victory in the making was greeted by cheers from Iraqis in the lobby of the Al Rashid Hotel, home to foreign journalists in Baghdad.
Allied headquarters.
And at about the same time, the BBC and the Voice of America were telling anyone who wanted to listen about the successful Allied rout of the Iraqis on the first day of the war. Betsy Aaron, CBS News, Baghdad.
After emphasizing yesterday how well the ground war was going, both the Pentagon and the White House have begun to pull back, trying to dampen premature euphoria which they themselves created. In its private briefings for correspondents at the Pentagon, the U.S. military is now hammering home the message that the Republican Guard still present a real threat. Jim Stewart filed this report a few minutes ago.
We are told that the 80 Iraqi tanks that were spotted headed toward a confrontation with U.S. troops are actually the vanguard of an entire Republican Guard division, and that a significant ground battle may be only hours away. We are led to believe that an engagement from the air has already started with A-10 aircraft taking on the Republican Guard tanks, and that a ground war, a confrontation between this division-sized unit of the Republican Guard and U.S. forces will take place early this evening, Iraqi time, a matter of several hours from now. This is a quite significant event, Pentagon officials believe, because it marks the first time that U.S. forces will be taking on the very best of Saddam Hussein's army. The Republican Guard, as you know and have been reporting, have been staying in their fortifications to the north of Kuwait along the Iraqi border, and have only recently shown any sign of getting engaged in this fight. The 80 tanks that came out, we're led to believe, were the first element of that division that has come out to take on U.S. forces. And we are also told that as of this hour, U.S. losses in this war continue to be quite low. We're told that the number of killed in action, the number in the teens, Allied forces are believed to also be quite low as well. And finally, we're led to believe here that the liberation of Kuwait City, which of course is much awaited and would be a significant turning point in terms of progress in this war will not take place today. Most likely that is still a day away.
With the ground offensive in full swing, increasing attention is being paid here to the thorny question of how to restore peace and stability to the Middle East when the war is over. This morning, NBC set up a discussion between Republican Senator Richard Lugar and Senator John Kerry, a Democrat.
Senator Kerry, when the ground phase of Operation Desert Storm is over, will the United States be able to coexist with Saddam Hussein if, in fact, he's still in power?
Coexistence is perhaps the wrong term. Toleration may be better, and that sufferance at best. I suspect we're going to be stuck with a Saddam Hussein, but I also suspect that his military will be sufficiently weakened, and the structure of the aftermath of the process and the advantages, frankly, that we gain by having gone into this last land war version, specifically, the UN sanctions do not have to be lifted. There's no process by which that occurs, so we will maintain very significant leverage.
Senator Lugar, do you think we'll be, quote-unquote, stuck with Saddam Hussein once this is over?
No, I don't think we will be, or if we are, not for long. It appears to me from last August, 2/3 of the American people, and that's now closer to 3/4, believe that Saddam must go either during the war or during the peace thereafter. And it seems to me it's already clear that if Saddam is still alive and in leadership at the end of the war, that through the economic sanctions Senator Kerry has mentioned, or simply the cutoff of any possibility of Iraqi exporting oil, getting any money in the country, reconstructing the country, the pressures by the coalition will be sufficient to change not only Saddam, and I would hope also the Ba'athist Party group around him, who have been a tremendous problem for Iraq.
Senator Lugar, what kind of U.S. presence do you think will be needed to ensure post-war stability in the region?
Well, for the time being, a sizable one. After the conflict is concluded, we will want to work with our Saudi friends and with the Kuwaitis and with others who have been out there on the battle lines and see really how much assistance they need. But we want to make certain that the economic sanctions work to make certain that we have a peaceful government and a constructive situation in Iraq.
Senator Kerry, should we take on the role as the world's policeman, do you think?
Well, I don't think actually the world's policeman, no, but are we going to be involved where our interests are clearly at stake? Absolutely, and our interests were clearly at stake in this region. I would like to see us try to move that involvement more under the United Nations. I think would be better for us and better for the world.
Some people are watching the ground offensive with great trepidation and concern that the young soldiers who have been shown on television being so gung-ho about wanting to confront the enemy may not have any idea what they're getting into. NBC sought the views of a group of Vietnam veterans who spoke about the first time they went into battle.
There is a moment when every pore and ounce of your body is alive in a way that it has never been alive before.
The emotions are incredibly powerful.
It's a great adventure until you've seen somebody blasted in front of you and have their blood all over you. Then it becomes reality. Then you have a sense of your own mortality.
The mission first is to survive. And the first shots of small fire, especially small arms especially, will bring home that this could be their last moment.
I remember each step that I took was one in which was a conscious decision. It took a great deal of effort to, in some ways, keep moving toward the darkness.
It was the first time I'd ever been shot at in my life, and I remember thinking that there probably wasn't enough dirt in the world for me to dig a hole in to get in. I couldn't get out of the line of fire fast enough.
I can remember the first time I really saw combat. I began to shake the next morning.
When we were shot at, it was surprising. I wasn't quite as prepared for it as I thought I was. And that, yeah, the real fear, and then the reality that I, of course, could have been killed.
There's a certain innocence that almost protects you that first time. It kind of gets worse. At least for me, it got worse each time we went down the road.
I don't think I had time to recognize the emotions other than that the amount of fear and the reality, the awesome reality of human beings being blasted into pieces and observing them possibly at their last moments, it's a dirty way to die.
That's a look at what the TV networks have been doing. As far as the newspapers are concerned, several papers use the same photograph on their front pages of captured Iraqi soldiers trudging through the Kuwaiti desert in a long line. The Washington Post uses the picture to dramatic effect right across the top of its front page, and underneath is the headline, "Allies meet little resistance and capture thousands of prisoners of war." The Post says that U.S. pilots, as the push into Kuwait and Iraq began, described a kind of huge mechanical steeplechase with countless tanks, armoured personnel carriers and other vehicles tearing pell-mell northward across the desert. The Post quotes one pilot as saying, "I can't fathom the size of this operation. You've heard people talk about the enormity of the air power, but this pales in comparison." In a separate front-page story, the Post warns that the pursuit of these goals, that is to dismantle much of the Iraqi military, is likely to bring much more difficult and potentially bloody fighting tonight or Tuesday, when the Allied forces get into a position to engage the Republican Guard. The New York Times also says that the operation was so huge and far-flung that its dimensions were hard to grasp, and it gives front-page space to a very nicely written report from the front by one of its correspondents, datelined in Iraq, February the 24th. It describes how the 101st Airborne Division established a giant fortified gas station in the desert to fuel helicopters for assaults in the strategic Euphrates River Valley. Inside the New York Times, there's a story saying that although Bush administration officials are not prepared to say it publicly, they are making it increasingly clear that the United States now considers the downfall of President Saddam Hussein and the elimination of his Ba'ath Party structure not only the most desirable ending to the war, but also an attainable outcome. There's discussion, too, in the papers about the Pentagon's highly restrictive news policy introduced for the ground offensive, which the papers note was loosened when Allied field commanders came forward with glowing reports of early success in the war zone. The New York Times says that many American news executives are deeply concerned about the curbs, which they see as the latest and possibly most troubling example of Defense Secretary Dick Cheney's efforts to control the flow of information from Washington.
Diana, what are the opinion writers saying in the papers this morning in the United States?
Well, of course, there's a lot of editorial comment about the ground offensive. The Washington Post says that the final stage of the Gulf War is on, in circumstances pitting the great power of the Allied coalition against the desperation of Saddam Hussein. The Post says that it's a confrontation that could produce some further sickening displays by Iraq before it culminates in the victory that the Allies' superior resources would seem to ensure. The paper says that it's obviously too soon to draw conclusions about the military aspect of the campaign, but it's not too soon to give credit to the diplomacy that put and kept together the coalition fighting the war. And the Post says that although it will be asked whether Mr. Bush rushed to a ground war without giving Soviet diplomacy a fair chance, Saddam Hussein was using the last few days not to position Iraq for a compromise settlement, but to launch terrible scorched earth operations in Kuwait. In its lead editorial, the New York Times cautions against unwarranted optimism about how the ground war is going. It says that one by one, President Bush's senior aides fanned out to the television studios yesterday to hail the auspicious beginning of the ground war. The Times says that their assessments recalled the euphoria generated by the first night of bombing in January, when a high-tech firestorm seemed to presage swift collapse of Saddam Hussein's war machine. But the Times says the machine did not collapse, and the paper says that on this occasion, Iraq's best troops have yet to be tested. It adds that Saddam Hussein is a resourceful foe, and as the torching of Kuwait shows, a vengeful one. He answered the Allied air barrage by launching Scuds at Israel, and the Times says that it will be foolish to assume that he's incapable of some new brutal retaliation.
Diana Goodman in Washington, thank you very much. Christopher Lee, we were talking, 20 or so minutes ago, just after we'd listened to excerpts from the Saudi briefing from their Joint Forces Commander, Lieutenant General Prince Khalid bin Sultan, about war crimes and trials of the perpetrators of such crimes. And we'd come to no very great conclusion as to who would organise the trials, where, and indeed under whose law, because there's always, isn't there, the worry of what you might term victor's justice in this.
I mean, it was interesting. I mean, Paul was saying that under the Britain has a legislation for trying war criminals. And I suppose we then get down to a great international argument of exactly who is allowed to try. For example, if somebody says that the opposing forces have committed atrocities, and that can be defined as war crimes against your own nationals, then in theory, just as the Israelis have put on trial Germans from the Second World War, then presumably nationals or one country can try another's if it believes that it committed sins against its own nationals. There's also another part of this, of course, and that is that the fact that the mechanism isn't in place, that nobody is quite clear. But where the mechanism is in place is within single countries. And we have to remember that there have been times in the past where a country has tried its own people for war crimes.
Major Cali in the United States, My Lai massacre, that...
Yes, that sort of thing. And so we shouldn't ignore that side of it. But it was interesting that when the prince was asked, does that mean you're going to go after Saddam Hussein? And he said, oh no, he was most definite about it. He said, no. He said, that is up to the Iraqi people to deal with Saddam Hussein. I'm not suggesting that there will be a war tribunal against Saddam Hussein, but that's the sort of thing that he was talking about.
And of course, in the fact that this is within the Islamic world, of course, the Sharia, the holy law, would come into play. And if you read the Holy Quran, for example, it's quite explicit at times on conduct in war, as it is in conduct of every Muslim's life from dawn to dusk.
Yes, but it does give alternatives, the Quran as well.
I mean, just one final point to you, though. I mean, you talk about war crimes. I mean, it was quite interesting when those Allied pilots were paraded on television and we said this was an infringement of the Geneva Convention. See at what's going on in Kuwait at a meeting with a member of the Kuwait National Council. John Spicer has spent a day with Kuwaitis in London.
Despite the desperate worries of their parents, the children, comprehending little of what's going on in their country, clearly regarded a morning in the sun outside their embassy as great fun and sang their national anthem lustily whenever called on to do so.
وطني الكويت وطني الكويت وطني الكويت سلم سلم نجدي.
But tears came to the eyes of their mothers and elder sisters when I talked to them about their hopes and fears of what they will find in their country when they finally go back.
I think it will be quite devastated. I think what we heard is that a lot of buildings have been burnt, a lot of companies, a lot of banks. We know a lot of people have been killed. We know a lot of people have been taken to prisons. I don't think it's going to be a nice sight. I don't think it's something, no matter how much we know of, it will never sink unless we see it. And the people have changed after enduring so much for the past 7 months. To tell you the truth, I'm very scared. I don't want, I'm dreading the moment when I have to face it. But I'm also eager to see it, to see Kuwait, to see my land. I think I'll just kiss the land the minute I get there.
Hopefully we'll find everything's okay, although the country is destroyed. But doesn't matter if our people are still there, we could rebuild it again.
But are you worried, though, that perhaps people have been taken away? We're hearing these stories.
Yes, of course, we're very concerned and worried. But because I think the land battle, you know, it's something that makes us, at least we would know that something is being done. That something is being done for Kuwaitis. And if our people died in Kuwait and or are going to die because of the battle and war, I think they've sacrificed themselves to liberate their land.
I'm worried about the people, our families and our friends, who we're going to find and who we're not going to find. You know, like maybe my brother's alive but my sister isn't, or her kids aren't. That's what I'm worried about. But the buildings can be rebuilt. It's just that the people, the minds of the people. And we thank the Allies and God bless them for what they've done.
They are, you know, executing people there, and they burning, you know, the all houses, and they are sitting there in our houses there because they all destroy this where they are located there in the schools and all the stadiums and all other, you know, places that they were gathered there. So we hope that this whole war will end and, you know, peacefully, more or less, for all the Allied and the Americans and the British people too.
The vigil outside the embassy was organised by the Campaign for Free Kuwait. I asked one of the organisers what they were hoping to show.
We just want people to know that Kuwait does still exist, will always exist, and we're here to show solidarity with our families in Kuwait and solidarity with the Allied troops. We're not celebrating. It's a sad day also.
What do you think will be found when Kuwait's liberated, which is obviously going to be? Are you very worried about? who might be missing when you get there?
A lot of people are missing. A lot in the last few days have been, thousands more have been taken to Iraq. We don't know who's been killed in the last few days. We just hope to be able to, those who are still in Kuwait will be alive and well. And it's the liberation of the people. They need it. They've suffered a lot the last few months.
Earlier, the Foreign Secretary had a 15-minute meeting with Mr. Jassim Mohammed, a member of the Kuwait National Council. Mr. Hurd expressed his sympathy and concern at what was going on. As he left the Foreign Office, I asked Mr. Mohammed to describe his own particular fears.
The fears are for the people of Kuwait, for the Allied forces who are going against people, an army who cares very little about human life, their own included. This is very sad. That's our greatest fear. Kuwaitis here also fear that once they go back to Kuwait, who they will find and who they will not find. Members of their family, close friends, because we have been disconnected. And that is another fear that we are experiencing now.
Are you in touch at all? Have you any contacts there at the moment?
No, I have not had contact with my family. I was in Kuwait during the invasion, and I had to leave because of the Iraqi suppression for the sake of my family. I had to leave through the borders and through Khafji. And ever since, which has been towards the end of last August, I have not heard, except very little information, old information, which seemed that they were fine, but this is about 2 months ago. I have no idea what it is right now.
So you must be very worried.
Terribly worried. But all the Kuwaitis, we all feel alike, we feel the same. No one misery is worse than the other. We all dread it, and we hope that the coalition forces stop the Iraqis from taking away the Kuwaitis by force from our borders. I just hope to God that they surround them and keep them in our country, including the Iraqi forces, to take them to justice and save the lives of the innocent people of Kuwait.
That report was by John Spicer, spending the day with Kuwaitis, who, for today, is in fact their National Day, February the 25th. You're listening at the present moment to Radio 4 News FM. I'm Peter Hobday. Just after the news at 3 o'clock, we hope to go to the US military briefing in Riyadh. But now, Peter Donaldson with the news at 3. In Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, it's the American briefing that we'll be going to, I hope, in the next couple of minutes. The briefer this afternoon will be Brigadier General Richard Neal, who's becoming quite famous. Maybe you can comment for about 30 seconds, Chris.
Yes, that's the colonel, the public relations colonel, who's just about to introduce the briefer, who in fact is Brigadier General Butch Neal.
So, to Riyadh.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As General Schwarzkopf told you last night, operational security considerations in the early stages of the battle necessarily limit the level of detail in which I will describe what is occurring on the battlefield. Let me first qualify my comments by reminding you that the battlefield is a dynamic and ever-changing place, and that these initial reports are just that, initial reports, and they may change as further details become known to us. In ground operations, we are now into the second day of ground campaign and the 39th day of Operation Desert Storm. We are continuing to attack and continue to achieve tremendous success against the Iraqi forces in the KTO. Our ground forces continue to encounter light to moderate resistance and are currently ahead of schedule in securing their planned objectives. Across the front, coalition forces continue to capture large numbers of enemy prisoners of war, in some cases entire battalions at a time. Marine, Army, French, and Saudi forces have captured more than 18,000 enemy prisoners of war to date. Coalition forces are engaging armor and mech forces with great success. During the late morning and early afternoon today, Marines engaged an armor and mech force destroying 50 to 60 tanks. An Army armor brigade operating with Marine forces engaged another armor mech unit consisting of over 150 vehicles. And initial reports indicate again tremendous success. The fight goes on. Just as I left the war room and came over here, I received another updated report from separate situations that Marine and Army forces have reported the capture of 20 T-62 tanks, 40 APCs, and over 400 EPWs. In another incident, 50 Tu-62 tanks are parked within 4 kilometers of their position, with the Iraqi crews indicating their desire to surrender. An additional 2,100 EPWs have been captured since I gave you those last numbers, and 20 to 30 tanks have been destroyed. Late this afternoon, United States Air Force A-10s, working in conjunction and close coordination with U.S. Army armored units, destroyed an additional 35 tanks. Since the beginning of the ground offensive, coalition forces have destroyed more than 270 tanks and continue to attack all types of vehicles and other types of emplacements. And again, I would emphasize these are extremely conservative results. Since the beginning of the ground campaign, casualties remain extremely light. One casualty obviously is too many. As of this afternoon, initial reports indicate that 4 U.S. servicemen have been killed and 21 have been wounded in action. However, I must again say that these are initial reports and all of the numbers cannot be confirmed at this date. Air operations, United States Air Force, Marine Corps, United States Navy, and coalition air forces continue the air campaign. Yesterday, we flew over 3,000 missions, including 1,300 in the KTO. Of that 1,300, over 700 were dedicated to close air support. Today, the same tempo of operation continues. Since the last time I briefed you, we have lost 4 U.S. aircraft, 2 AV-8Bs, 1 Apache AH-64, and 1 A-10 in combat operations. Of the 5 pilots involved, 3 have been rescued. Naval operations and naval and marine amphibious operations continue all along the coast of Kuwait. Terrorism continues as the only Iraqi success to report to date. We have seen an increase in Iraqi terrorism throughout the KTO. As of 1300 this afternoon, we can confirm over 600 fires burning in the KTO. Of these, at least 517 are wellheads. Additionally, numerous facilities throughout Kuwait City are being systematically destroyed. Reports of atrocities of the worst sort are continuing to come in through reports. In closing, let me underscore the fact that to date, we have employed only a small portion of our total combat power. There is much more to come. This completes my prepared remarks. I can answer a few questions before leaving. General. Susan?
Can you tell us anything at the moment about the Republican Guard in terms of whether or not the Republican Guard is coming out? Are they moving at all?
We have engaged some forces of the Republican Guards and enjoy the same success that we're having against other forces.
General?
Yes.
Would you say right now that this is a one-sided battle? You seem to be reporting a great deal of success and very little failure.
I wouldn't say it's one-sided. I would just say that we're enjoying success where we're meeting the enemy, we're defeating the enemy. Yes, ma'am.
Can you give us some more details on the Republican Guards? Are they resisting, are they fighting, or are they surrendering?
They're being beaten. Yes.
There's a report of a column of 80 Republican Guard tanks heading south and reports that a major tank battle is going to be occurring momentarily. Do you have any information about that?
I can't confirm or deny that particular report, but let me say that as my report would indicate, or my prepared remarks is, we've run into substantial numbers of tanks and we've defeated them. Yes, sir.
Have you run into and engaged with your own armored forces T-72 tanks?
We have destroyed 35 T-72s as I speak. Yes, sir.
General, can you tell me the KIA, was that one incident? How did that happen?
The KIA for U.S. casualties?
Yeah, 4.
No, that's a combination of situations, a total of 5 with 21 WIA. Yes, sir.
Has there been any sign of the Iraqi Air Force?
None whatsoever. Yes, sir.
Sir, how much is the progress made so far in capturing the Kuwait City as the capital?
I'm sorry?
Kuwait City. How much progress have you made in capturing it?
Kuwait City, we're moving towards Kuwait City, and we continue to experience success as we move in that direction. You got time for one more, Richard?
In Kuwait City, since these atrocities are going on, are you not taking steps to deal with this situation on an urgent basis?
I think the best way to answer that, Richard, is that we're continuing our campaign plan as we have structured it. We're ahead of schedule, as I told you, and I think that we're going to deal with that situation as we come upon it, but to try and do something specific and change the plan that might either put at risk U.S. or coalition forces, that would not be prudent planning by military commanders. Rick?
General, what can you tell us in terms of when you expect to wrap this thing up and the liberation of Kuwait be completed?
I can't give you a time frame on that, Rick. All I can say is that the U.S. and coalition forces are attacking with an aggressive spirit, and we're meeting the enemy, and we're not having any problem to date in destroying him. Thanks very much. That's all I have time for.
Well, we had the briefing there from Brigadier General Richard Neal, U.S. Marine Corps. Terse but detailed, I suppose, is one way of describing it. Quite short. He knew what he wanted to say. He said it, and he didn't want to say anything else.
Well, that's right. Well, he's got to go back and get on with the war. I mean, it's as simple as that. And that is one of the problems when you expect a high standard of briefer, which he is. I mean, operations department in Central Command, and if you're going to have the organ grinder, then you can't have him for too long. Lots of information in it. I mean, far too much for me to keep track of. I mean, and this is one of the problems of getting information together. I mean, he was talking about, for example, 60 tanks signifying that they wished to give up. He was talking about another 50 tanks had been destroyed, from an armoured mechanized division. He talked about ARMMech, that's Armoured Mechanized Division. He was talking about another 150 vehicles attacked. The Marine Corps had captured vehicles here and there. He said, I think, eventually that about 270 tanks have been destroyed since the start of this land campaign. Now, on casualties, he said that I think it was 4 United States soldiers or servicemen had been killed and 21 had been wounded in action. But he made the point later on that this was in a combination of situations, as he called it. It wasn't just in one particular action. So these are extraordinarily light casualties. Air missions, 3,000 air missions were flown yesterday, 1,300 of them, not surprising, over Kuwait. And for the first time, we're getting these reports of the air missions, what is known as close air support, 700 close air support. Now this means, for example, aeroplanes protecting tank advances. For example, a tank reports another column of tanks or dug in position, so they call up the Harriers or the tank busters, these very sort of stiff-winged aeroplanes, with wings sticking straight out the side, and they turn around very quickly, can fly very, very slowly, can line up a tank very, very easily, and this is known as close air support. This is in support of the army on the ground.
I get a sense, coming out of that briefing, it's quite interesting. A lot of people have been saying earlier in the day, and it's been coming out from briefings that have been taking place at the Pentagon and the rest of it, that we must guard against euphoria. These are early days. Schwarzkopf, the Allied commander, said it yesterday. And yet, just take that briefing that we've just heard from General Neal, and the details, the figures. It's very difficult not to be euphoric with those sort of numbers, isn't it? I mean, he did nothing to dampen down expectations. He was asked about the Republican Guard. We're meeting him and we're beating him, he said.
That's right. I think we have 2 points here. One is that when things are going so well, the generals and the politicians will say, for goodness sake, don't let people get too excited, because if we do come up against a brick wall at some point, then they're going to say, hey, what happened? You told us everything was going swimmingly. The second part of it is, these are initial reports, and they are troops advancing against the weakest, or by and large, against the weakest form of opposition that they could ever have expected. And we also have to get back to the basic point, and something which we've stressed time and time again, and it's this. The coercion forces, by and large, represent, in sporting terms, the first 11. They set off in this war fighting the second 11. They then took their mighty air power and reduced that second 11 to the third, fourth and fifth teams. We're now seeing the ground forces going in against that sort of opposition, and I think, although one says tremendous caution, these are initial reports, it's still very, very true that the strongest, one of the strongest armed forces we've ever seen, attacking what is now one of the weakest armed forces that we have seen in such quantity.
Chris, thank you very much for that briefing on the briefing, so to speak. It'd be interesting to know what's going through Yasser Arafat's mind at the present moment. Or maybe we can find out in an interview that he's given to ABC News, that's ABC News of Australia. He, of course, could well turn out to be one of the biggest losers in the Gulf crisis, because by publicly embracing Saddam Hussein shortly after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, he eroded support for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Well, just after the land war began, he granted a pretty rare interview at the present moment at his heavily guarded headquarters in Tunis. It was Peter George of Australia's ABC News who spoke to him, and Mr. George asked Yasser Arafat why he'd aligned himself and the PLO with Saddam Hussein.
you have to understand that Saddam Hussein had supported the Palestinians when he had mentioned for the first time to make this linkage between the oil, which was the main reason for the American and European military presence in this area.
Did President Saddam tell you before the invasion of Kuwait that he would link it with the Palestinian issue?
No.
Was there any promise of this?
No. This linkage was a request from our people under occupation. This is very important, under occupation. To President Saddam Hussein, after the Gulf crisis started, to make this linkage. And he had accepted it